Forgotten Voices is brought to you in part by Marcy's Law for Oklahoma. Yes on State Question 794. You're listening to the new media. You're listening to Mitchell Talks. Learn more at MitchellTalks.com and follow me, Scott Mitchell, on Twitter at MitchellTalks. Strangulation has been identified as one of the most lethal forms of domestic violence and sexual assault. Unconsciousness may occur within seconds and death within minutes. When domestic violence perpetrators choke their victims, not only is this felonious assault, but it may be an attempted homicide. Recently, the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention came to Oklahoma City. Now, the Institute was developed in response to the increasing demand for intimate partner violent strangulation crimes training and technical assistance from communities all across the world and in Oklahoma. One of the founders of the Institute is Casey Gwinn. He's credited as a pioneer of the Family Justice Center concept, under which multiple agencies work together under one roof to provide services to victims of domestic violence and sexual abuse. I visited recently with Mr. Gwinn to talk about what Oklahomans really need to know about domestic violence, sexual assault, elder and child abuse. But here's a heads up. It's radically different from some of the talking points we've been hearing from justice reform advocates for the past 3 legislative sessions. When we come back, my conversation with Casey Gwinn, the president of Alliance for Hope International.
Every day, new individuals and families are impacted by a range of crime, from white-collar to violence. Hello, my name is Kim Moyer, and I'm the State Director of Marcy's Law for Oklahoma, State Question 794. A lot of these families find out the hard way that our criminal justice system is set up to protect the rights of the accused criminal, not the rights of the victim. Many of them feel abandoned or ignored. Marcy's Law for Oklahoma, State Question 794, provides constitutional protections to victims and their families and ensures that they have a voice in the criminal justice system. You can vote to support victims of crime by voting yes on State Question 794. To share your story or learn more about State Question 794, visit ok.marcyslaw.us. This message is authorized and paid for by Marcy's Law for Oklahoma, State Question 794.
It's a program of Alliance for Hope International, and one of the founders of Hope International is Casey Gwinn. Good to have you on Mitchell Talks.
Great to be with you, Scott.
Tell us why that people need to know about this. Secondarily, why don't we know about this?
It's not a topic the public really understands or has ever been educated on, but here's the truth. Men who strangle women, quote, choke women in intimate relationships are the most dangerous men on the planet. They're the most dangerous men in Oklahoma. They're the most dangerous men in the United States. They are the killers in this country, and we are figuring it out, and now we have to do something about it.
We have underway what's called criminal justice reform in Oklahoma. Last year, a couple of lawmakers were really vilified because one of the things they stood against, and it actually resolved itself. Grateful that it did resolve itself and that strangulation was not lessened in importance in Oklahoma laws. Tell us about people who would do something like that or why they would do that. Is it just ignorance of what strangulation is that you would try to lessen the severity of the penalties on strangulation?
Well, God bless your legislators who stood in the gap. I think it's a combination of things that we're battling around the country. I think, one, there is an effort to minimize, quote, family violence or intimate partner violence. You know, it's not that big a deal. It's he said, she said, push, shove. We've got to stop incarcerating people when they commit, quote, petty crimes, unquote, because we can't lock everybody up and we're putting too many people in prison and too many poor people in prison. I get all that. But the bottom line is that when you're talking about these guys, and this is a male-dominated crime, by the way, women don't choke men. They have the strength to choke men, but they don't. This is men choking women in intimate relationships, in sexual assault cases. It's men choking children. It's men putting pressure on the neck of the elderly. Suffocation is part of that too, very often. And I think what's happening is it's not just an effort to minimize it we're battling. There is also at some level a latent kind of misogyny, a latent hostility toward women and women's rights and women's issues. And I understand backlash politics in America. I understand them as well as anybody around. But when it's all said and done, if you want to stop crime, if you want to really empty your prisons, you got to stop these guys before they're killing people, because most of your killers in Oklahoma are stranglers, and your police officers are dying at the hands of stranglers that have never been prosecuted or held accountable for putting pressure on a woman's neck. And everybody's minimizing it because you can strangle somebody to death with no external visible injuries. So people see it and there's nothing on her neck, and she says, he choked me, and they say, that's not any big deal. Well, if you can strangle somebody to death with no external visible injury, you can strangle somebody almost to death. And the stunning thing about these guys that we're learning is these aren't the same guys that are slapping or punching women. This is a different level of power and control. When I put pressure on a woman's neck in an intimate relationship, I am telling her that I'm God and that I decide whether she lives or dies. And it also, by the way, in our research now tells us that if a man puts his hand around a woman's neck one time in an intimate relationship, she is 750% more likely to later be killed by him. Just one time he puts pressure on her neck, we now know he's more likely to be a killer.
Now, from some perspective, your organization began in the early 2000s, actually at the White House. This was something that you were doing, and President Bush elevated this program. Tell us a little bit how that came to be so that we know where we're at today on this issue.
It was an amazing journey. I was a prosecutor. I grew up in a home impacted by some violence and abuse, though my dad was the president of Christian Camping International. My dad had grown up in an abusive home. My dad did some things to me and to my siblings that I have sent people to prison for as a prosecutor. He did it in the name of discipline. But I will tell you that I grew up not realizing that my family was unhealthy in that way. I just thought all families were like that. I went to Stanford University. I went to UCLA School of Law, became a prosecutor in San Diego, got married. And then it was a divine appointment in my life. I started handling child abuse and domestic violence cases. And I started handling those cases and thinking, this doesn't seem right that people are doing this to kids and doing this to women. And it was mostly men committing crimes against women. And then it started evolving, and we thought, look how many places families have to go to get help once there's violence. And very often, if there's adult violence, there's also child abuse. So there's this intersection of child abuse and domestic violence. And then we started finding a lot of these rage-filled men are also raping women, girlfriends, wives, forced sex. And so we get into the early 90s, and I started realizing all the victims were kind of recanting. They didn't want to press charges. I don't want to press charges against my husband. Then they'd go back to them, and nobody understood it. So we led the effort in San Diego to say, we're going to prosecute these cases with or without the victim's participation. Why should they have to be responsible for that? Somebody robs a bank. It doesn't matter if the bank wants to press charges. We prosecute bank robbers in America. Why? Because money's really important, and we don't want people robbing banks. And so we go after bank robbers, whether the bank wants to prosecute or not. So why aren't we prosecuting violent men? So we started prosecuting, and got some national attention. Tom Brokaw and Katie Couric did a national profile with a reporter named Chris Hansen from the To Catch a Predator series, profiled us on national television. Then I became the elected prosecutor in San Diego, and our dream had always been, let's put all the services in one place so victims don't have to go 20 places for help. Go here for the cops, go here for the courts, go here for counseling, go here for job training, go here for civil legal services. Let's have one place. And that dream came true in 2002 with the opening of the San Diego Family Justice Center. First time in history anywhere on the planet that we'd put 25 agencies under one roof. Cops, prosecutors, advocates, doctors, nurses, therapists, chaplains, victims and their kids could come one place. And we were working on child abuse and sexual assault and domestic violence cases all together. And it was magic. We didn't see it as a national thing. We certainly didn't think it was relevant to Oklahoma or any place else in the country. It was just our relationship building with everybody. I was very close to the police chief, and he was very committed to a community-oriented policing kind of philosophy. And we started working with community organizations, with the African-American community, Latino community, and we built the center. And it opened. It was a big splash in San Diego, and we didn't think it was anything but that. And then 3 months later, I was invited to be on Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey endorsed the model in January of 2003 and said, why should a victim have to go 32 places to get help? That doesn't make any sense. And I was on Oprah for 2 days of the national broadcast. And at the end of it, Oprah said, I just changed the rest of your life. And I laughed. And I said, I'm married. I have kids. I'm the elected prosecutor in San Diego. I didn't say this out loud, but I laughed because I thought, you didn't change my life. I mean, Chicago's nice for a couple of days, but I'm headed home. And she was kind of sassy, and she said, you didn't hear me. I just changed the rest of your life. And I kind of laughed again, and I said, it's an honor to meet you. And she kind of rolled her eyes and walked away. And within 2 years, we'd had site visitors from 77 countries come to the San Diego Family Justice Center. And 4 months after we opened the center, I got a call from Laura Bush's chief of staff, who said, we'd like you to come to the White House and talk to Laura Bush and Margaret Spelling, who was the domestic policy advisor of the president. We're going to have a meeting with John Ashcroft and Tommy Thompson, and the president wants to think about what he can do to address violence against women in this country. So in April, I was at the White House in a small group meeting. I got 5 minutes to say what I thought George W. Bush should do about violence in America in families. And I said, I think he should open more family justice centers. We're trying it in San Diego. Let's see what it looks like in a tribal community. What does it look like in a rural community, a suburban community? What does it look like in New York versus San Diego? What does it look like in Tulsa, Oklahoma, compared to Tampa, Florida? And they thanked me. I shook everybody's hand, and I left. And I thought, that's kind of fun. I was there for an hour and heard nothing until October 1st. And I got invited to come to the West Wing entrance of the White House at 1:30 on October 8th. And I thought, what's going on? They said, we're not at liberty to say, but you need to be at the West Wing entrance to the White House. The president's going to be making some remarks that day, and we want you there. Then I started hearing from friends all over the country in the sexual assault, domestic violence movement. A lot of feminist leaders who, of course, hated George Bush were also invited to the White House that day, and they all went to the East Wing entrance to the White House. And at 1:30, I went in the West Wing entrance to the White House. I was ushered into a room overlooking the Rose Garden. I stood, I waited, and in came George Bush with a Marine on both sides of him, came up to me, said, Casey, we're following your leadership today. It's an honor to have you at the White House. And I didn't know why I was there. And I said, Mr. President, I'm following your leadership. And he said, no, you're in charge of all this. And I didn't know what this was. And we talked for a little while about baseball, Texas Rangers, and then George Bush said, well, they're waiting for me to say something stupid out there, and you're my date, so we better get in there. There's 250 people and 40 television cameras. And I reached out for his hand, and I said, Mr. President, this is a divine appointment in my life. And George Bush pulled himself to within 6 inches of my face and said, this is a divine appointment for both of us, Casey, let's go be faithful. And I walked in with the President of the United States to 250 people, and George Bush announced the President's Family Justice Center initiative and said, what Casey Gwinn's done in San Diego, we're going to do all over America. And we're going to give victims one place to go for everything they need: doctors, nurses, cops, prosecutors, chaplains, therapists. And he funded 15 pilot centers from Tulsa, Oklahoma to New York City, to Sitka, Alaska, to a tribal community, to St. Louis, Missouri, to Tampa, Florida. They were all over the country. And for 2 years, I worked for the Bush Justice Department after I left office, and we opened these centers. And we learned what the model could look like. What could this look like? How's Tulsa different than San Diego? How's Texas cities different? And we went all over the country and did it. And most of them worked. They didn't all work. This is really complicated. But Oklahoma started figuring it out too. And first came the Tulsa Family Safety Center. And then after the president's initiative, Palomar has opened in OKC now. And Palomar is on fire. Palomar is doing amazing work. Homicide rates are going down in Oklahoma. Even though there's this battle to try to hold criminals accountable, by creating collaborative services, we're starting to gain some traction in Oklahoma. Oklahoma 4 years ago was number 4 in America in women murdered in intimate relationships. This year, Oklahoma has moved out of the top 10. Now, there are still women dying often in Oklahoma, but we're starting to gain some traction. We just need to build on that momentum if we're really going to break this generational cycle of family violence.
You speak about collaborative efforts. What is expand on that, if you would, and also why are the numbers going down in Oklahoma? Because most indicators in Oklahoma over the past decade that are bad have been going up.
Yeah. Well, I think there are a number of things happening. When I talk about collaboration, I mean we're getting agencies out of their silos. If the legislature of Oklahoma really wants to make a difference, they should focus on building collaboratives like we're doing. And they should put state money into it. And VOCA money is coming into it from the feds. The state should be part of this too. Because when cops work in a silo, they don't do as good a work as when they're together with advocates or together with prosecutors or together with doctors and nurses. When doctors and nurses work in a silo, they don't do as good a work as when they're with other disciplines. Everybody lives in silos, and we kind of like our silos. We say we want to work together, but cultures are different in different professions. The child abuse people are over here. The sexual assault people are over here. The domestic violence people over here. The shelter's over here, and it's confidential, so nobody can talk about it. So it can't really be a vehicle for social change. And then along comes the Family Justice Center model in Oklahoma, and suddenly it's not secret anymore, and it's a public place, and we're not hiding, and we don't want victims to have to hide. We want perpetrators to hide. Men who are violent and abusive, who are abusing their kids and their spouse, and then those kids grow up and abuse their kids and their spouse, and then they commit the other crimes in this culture. That's how a collaborative can work to change that. So I do think that the reason we're gaining ground is because collaboration saves lives. When cops and prosecutors and advocates work together, the information gets better, intelligence gets better. We prevent terrorist attacks more often in this country when we have good intelligence. And women die less often in family violence when we know what the perp's doing. We know what his threats are. We know what kind of weapons he's got. We know what kind of threats he's made. I mean, what's happening right now in Oklahoma, you had 2 officers die last year in Oklahoma. David Wade died and Justin Turney died, both killed by domestic violence stranglers who were never held accountable. And both those officers didn't know. Justin Turney was on a traffic stop. David Wade was serving an eviction notice. He had no idea that he was dealing with a strangler that had previously had charges dismissed for strangulation. If they'd known the intelligence, if they'd had the information, if they'd been working with everybody else in the system and they knew those killers, Nathan LaForce was the killer of David Wade, and Justin Turney was killed by a guy named Byron Shepard, both rage-filled men who grew up in abusive homes, who were never held accountable. If the officers had had that information, they'd be alive today, and their families wouldn't have buried them. So information is power, and you get that out of collaboration.
Now, this course that's going on here in Oklahoma City is, well, it looks like there are not any silos, or the silos have joined together. Who all have you trained this week?
It's been an amazing week. This is the largest 4-day training institute on strangulation prevention we've done anywhere in the country. We train for the FBI Academy, we train for the feds, we train for tribal folks. We train all over America. This is the biggest one we've ever done. In our peak yesterday, I think we had almost 140. We've been between 130 and 140 each day. And that's doctors, nurses, mental health professionals, cops, prosecutors. It's been an amazing mix of folks here, and we seat them in multidisciplinary teams. All the exercises are done in multidisciplinary teams, and it's this big aha moment for everybody that's here because they realize they're more powerful when they work together in these teams. And if you just put officers off by themselves, and I am a fan of law enforcement has been vilified and demonized in this country for the last decade. I'm a fan of law enforcement, but I will tell you, when they work alone, they're not nearly as effective as when they work in multidisciplinary teams. And they think differently, and they get a different perspective when they're side by side with advocates and side by side with chaplains and side by side with prosecutors and others. So we're doing that this week in Oklahoma City. And what we see out of it comes amazing momentum. The other thing we're seeing out of it is, I refer to it as the science of hope. But what we're seeing is, if you don't have hope in your life, if you're burned out, if you're tired, if you've been attacked and put down, and you're going to crime calls day after day. You get vicarious trauma sucks the life right out of you. And I found a lot of demoralized cops here this week, a lot of demoralized prosecutors whose budgets have been cut, don't have enough staffing to do their job. And when they come together, they start to feel like, hey, maybe there's some hope. Hey, maybe if we work together, maybe if we recruit the public, maybe if we get the business community involved, that the schools will help us. If we can all start thinking together about children impacted by trauma, because at the end of the day, 80% of the problems you're struggling with in Oklahoma connect to kids growing up in homes with poverty, violence, abuse, drugs, and alcohol. 80%. Almost everybody that goes to prison in Oklahoma came out of homes with child abuse and domestic violence and some mix of drugs and alcohol, and usually the lack of a missing parent, usually a missing father. And when you put those things together, it's toxic in the lives of kids. And so, yes, that's the good side of criminal justice reform, is we're not solving our problems by locking everybody up. But the answer is not just to dump everybody out of prison, because you're not solving anything doing that. Right now, I don't know if you know this or not, Alliance for Hope International, our organization, we're tracking a Google search called While Out on Bail. While Out on Bail. And it's this release effort that's going on all across America, where the only thing we're deciding now when you get arrested for a crime is, are you going to appear in court later? We don't look at the seriousness of the crime. We don't look at what the crime is. Just are you going to come back to court? Because otherwise we don't want to punish you by putting you in jail. While out on bail, we're now seeing a murder every 10 days in the United States, including in Oklahoma. A murder every 10 days by a criminal who is out on bail. So don't tell me that criminal justice reform is saving lives, because it's not. People are dying because of criminal justice reform. And they're dying because we're not keeping the violent people, the sociopaths and the psychopaths, in jail when they deserve to be there, and stranglers are at the top of that list.
Well, it's very trendy, and some very trendy people are involved in this. What should we be doing in Oklahoma? You just mentioned the morale, which is a result of a lot of things. Of course, budget cuts. DAs have had enormous cuts to their budget. And by the way, they've been vilified during so-called criminal justice reform, especially in the media. Let's start with the media. What do they not know? What do they need to know?
Well, they need to focus on this fundamental truth. In America, we raise our criminals at home. And in America, we raise a lot of our victims at home, too. And if you really want to change a culture, you've got to go help trauma-exposed kids. And you do have to intervene in the home. And in the Bible Belt, we've got this weird dichotomy where on the one hand, the family is sacred and we want to support good, healthy families. On the other hand, we want the government to stay out of the family. Well, if you keep the government completely out of families where there's violence and abuse, you're just perpetuating this generational cycle. So you've got to do two things. You've got to focus on trauma-exposed kids and families where there's violence and abuse. And on the other side of it, when you become an adult and you still choose to commit acts of serious violence and abuse, like strangulation, for example, or rape, those men have to be held accountable. You can't say, you know what, I'm sorry you had a bad childhood. That's too bad. We're not going to put you in prison. We don't want to make you mad. We're going to give you another chance and another chance, because then people die, then more people get assaulted, then more crimes occur. You've got to treat the really serious crimes seriously and hold those perpetrators accountable. And on the other hand, you got to do early intervention work. You got to work at the top of the cliff and the bottom of the cliff. I agree with criminal justice reform, folks, that we will never arrest or prosecute our way out of crime in America. But you can't just vilify the criminal justice system. I had a funder in California the other day tell me, we're done with the criminal justice system. We're just plain done. We're putting all our money elsewhere. And I said, that is the most insane thing I've ever heard. The rule of law, we're done with the rule of law. You can beat, strangle, rape a child, and we're done with the criminal justice system. That's insane. You've got to maintain the rule of law. There's got to be consequences. They've got to be swift. They've got to be consistent. And on the other hand, we should be focusing on every trauma-exposed kid, because that 8-year-old that just watched his mom and dad in a fight last night is not going to learn in school. And if that kid's in a neighborhood where gunshots are flying through the window or flying over his house every night, he's not going to get sleep. He's not going to get rest. He's not going to get what he needs. And he's going to turn out to not be able to read a grade level. And then when he acts out in school, you know what you're going to do to him? You're going to expel him or suspend him. And once you expel him or suspend him, now you've demonized him, you've vilified him, you've shamed him and blamed him. And now he's going to end up the next generation of criminal. And now we're not going to put him in jail because we want criminal justice reform. So we're going to let him back out again and say, hey, we really don't want to do something bad to you. We don't want to punish you. And you've got this vicious cycle you've created.
It's time to quote Ron White, you can't fix stupid, but that's another discussion. Last couple of questions. One, what does trauma-exposed child mean? What are all of the traumas that we should be watching for? Does it involve food insecurity and lack of parents in the home? Tell me what you would say.
All those things can be what I call force multipliers, but when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, it's based on a national study that actually started in San Diego called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, and now it's moved all over the country. It's been administered to many in Oklahoma and to other states. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study measures 10 different kinds of trauma that a child can go through that includes things like being physically abused, sexually abused, witnessing domestic violence between your parents, having a parent who is drug or alcohol addicted, having an absent parent, having divorced parents, having an incarcerated parent. It can include neglect or abandonment, which could include homelessness, food insecurities, hunger, could be related to poverty. But those 10 markers produce a score between 0 and 10, and before you turn 18 years old. And the average ACE score of kids coming into, for example, Palomar, the Family Justice Center in Oklahoma City, the average ACE score is almost a 6 of kids coming into Palomar with their moms. Their moms' ACE scores are somewhere between 4 and 6. So that trauma index is a predictor of long-term issues in their life without intervention, without mitigation. And this is not just Oklahoma. I published a book in 2015 called Cheering for the Children that lays out the ACE study. Vince Felitti, the co-author of it, did the foreword for that book. And if you are 6 on the ACE scale, on average, you die 20 years younger than somebody who's a 0. You have higher rates of opioid use. Do you want to talk about opioids in Oklahoma? The primary users of opioids, it's not just about the prevalence of this addictive drug. It's also about trauma. So if you're a 6 on the ACE scale, the likelihood of using opioids goes up 4,600%. You're self-medicating. And if you make those pharmaceutical products easily available to kids and adults, they're going to gravitate to them instead of alcohol or marijuana. They're going to end up strung out on opioids. So it all connects. Drug abuse, alcohol abuse, people self-medicate. So that's what I'm talking about.
Tell people that are not on these boards and commissions and sitting on all of these VIP panels looking at criminal justice reform and others, what should the average Oklahoman be doing and be aware of to make this a better place?
Well, you should be advocating, for starters, for the legislature not abandoning the criminal justice system, because you're actually just cutting yourself off at the knees. If you don't give law enforcement the resources, cops and prosecutors and the court systems, to hold real criminals accountable and to have innovative models in the courts. I'm a fan of drug courts. I'm a fan of homeless courts. I'm a fan of specialized diversion at low levels. But if you don't support that criminal justice system to also hold really dangerous, scary people accountable, your homicide rates aren't going to go down across the board, and you're going to keep perpetuating this cycle. You should also be advocating for, why aren't we building more family justice centers in Oklahoma? Shawnee right now is working hard. They just passed a sales tax in Shawnee to fund the school system and to fund the Family Justice Center in Potawatomi and Lincoln counties. That should be happening all over Oklahoma. I mean, their population is only 75,000 people. They're building a 35,000 square foot village where all the services can be together. The churches can support it. So I say put more trauma-informed work in the schools. I say build family justice centers. I say engage the faith community. Don't just let the faith community silo either, and really get mentors into the lives of trauma kids, because criminal justice reform should really be about helping 7-year-olds. Your goal is not to love them when they're 35. You should love them when they're 10. You take a kid that has trauma, rage, violence, and abuse in his life and love him when he's 10 and help him realize he can go a different path than his father or stepfather, then you're never going to need to lock him up. You're never going to need to have the debate. I've been mentoring a boy since he was 11 years old. His name's Alex. Alex is now a senior in high school. Alex has a rage-filled father who abused him, a stepfather who abused him. Alex has had a lot of struggles, but we've loved Alex. He's gone to Camp Hope America every summer. Alex is now a counselor for us in Camp Hope. In August, Alex isn't going to prison. He's going to college. That's what we should be focusing on. Alex needed me when he was 11, and we've been loving him and mentoring him and getting him the support he needs in school. You create that kind of model in Oklahoma, and you'll have real criminal justice reform 20 years from now.
Casey Gwinn, thanks for all you do. God bless what you're doing. Hope to see you back here soon.
Thank you, Scott.
You're listening to the new media, the Mitchell Talks Network. Learn more at MitchellTalks.com and follow me, Scott Mitchell, on Twitter @MitchellTalks.